Bonsoir, je pense qu'on va attaquer. Merci beaucoup d'être là pour cette première séance de séminaire pour le projet Art d'Afrique pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale. On a initié ce projet à l'automne avec une journée d'études et donc là on lance un séminaire qui va se déployer sur l'ensemble de l'année. J'espère que vous pourrez aussi venir aux autres sessions. On a 6 sessions prévues en 2026 et on en prévoit 6 autres pour 2027. Donc ça va vraiment se développer sur 2 ans avec à chaque fois des sujets qui essaient d'alterner entre une perspective européenne et une perspective africaine en fonction des sessions. La prochaine sera axée autour de l'Éthiopie. En mai, ensuite en juin, on en a une sur l'IFAN au Sénégal, et ensuite à l'automne, on a une session sur le Cameroun, le 8 octobre, le 19 novembre autour des questions de législation en AOF et en Belgique, et enfin en décembre, une session sur les musées allemands et les acquisitions dans les musées en Allemagne. Donc voilà pour le programme pour cette année. L'année prochaine, c'est encore en cours de développement. Donc l'idée de ce projet est vraiment de penser la place des arts de l'Afrique dans le contexte de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, donc vraiment de penser le point de connexion entre, point de télescopage entre colonialisme et national-socialisme dans des contextes très différents, avec des contextes coloniaux très différents à travers le continent africain et aussi avec des contextes européens très différents. Donc voilà, on essaie de couvrir cette pluralité de perspectives par ce maillage en pointillé à travers ces séances de séminaire, comme on l'avait déjà initié avec la journée d'études. Les autres choses qu'on prévoit, je suis désolée, je passerai à l'anglais sous peu. Je suis désolée, je me suis lancée. Je m'appelle aussi Yael Biro, je suis coordinatrice scientifique ici à l'INHA et je mène donc ce projet sur les arts d'Afrique pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Les autres choses qu'on prévoit et à propos desquelles on est très content que ça se mette en place, c'est une série d'ateliers en Afrique avec une première session qui aura lieu en décembre à Dakar, qui sera suivie par une session en Éthiopie probablement en mai 2027, puis au Cameroun fin 2027 et enfin en Afrique du Sud début 2028. Donc voilà, on pense vraiment ce projet sur 3 ans à partir de fin 2025. Et aussi un atelier en Allemagne, justement sur la question des acquisitions dans les musées allemands, qui aura lieu en octobre, normalement, 2026. Voilà, pour les perspectives, tout ça sera aussi ponctué je l'espère, de capsules vidéo. L'ensemble de ces séances de séminaire sont enregistrées tant qu'on a l'autorisation des intervenants et donc ensuite disponibles sur la chaîne YouTube de l'INHA. Comme l'est d'ailleurs la journée d'études qu'on avait eue en novembre dernier, qui est aussi visible sur cette chaîne YouTube. Et puis, je remercie aussi Mathilde Siguelas qui est derrière, qui est postdoc, qui travaille sur le projet avec moi, Lola Myrti qui est derrière aussi en tant que doctorante contractuelle à l'INHA et qui travaille aussi sur ce projet et qui sera justement une des intervenantes pour la session sur l'Éthiopie le mois prochain. Et je vais maintenant me tourner vers nos intervenants de la journée pour cette première séance. Donc, ce sont nos cobayes. And I'm going to switch to English as I had warned you. So we have here today Daniel Hendrikse and Klaas Soetje, who are both from the NIOD, the Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam. So Daniel is a historian and works as a provenance researcher at the NIOD Institute. He's also affiliated with the University of Amsterdam as a guest lecturer, and he has published on several topics regarding German and Dutch cultural history. He's also a co-author of a guide for conducting provenance research in the Netherlands. And Klaas Soetje is senior researcher at the NIOD, working in the Expert Center Restitution. He's involved in a number of projects around the restitution of collections acquired in colonial contexts and has published several articles about the practice of doing provenance research in relation to cultural goods lost under the Nazi regime and in the colonial period. And finally, Stutje Klaas has written books and articles about anti-imperialism and Indonesia's political history. And we actually got in touch last year around the time of the study day, and I thought it would be really interesting for us to hear how the Netherlands are approaching these questions and this place of interaction between works collected within colonial context and national socialism, and because it seems that the Netherlands have actually a specific way of handling that history and have been thinking about that history, which is actually quite unique, I think, in the landscape. I actually don't know of other national institutions and research centers that have been really thinking about that place of interaction. So I look forward to hearing the two of you today. Thank you.
Okay, merci beaucoup. Can you all hear me? Yeah, I think so. Merci beaucoup, Yael. Et bonjour à toutes et à tous. D'abord, je voudrais exprimer notre gratitude et aussi notre honneur d'être invité à cet événement très intéressant. Je vais continuer en anglais parce que je me sens un peu plus à l'aise dans cette langue et aussi un peu plus flexible, mais quand il y a des questions ou quand on parle trop vite, dites-nous. And thank you also, Yael, for this for this introduction. For us, this is really a wonderful occasion to share our insights, to share some of the projects that we are working on, that we have been working on, a bit of our research agenda, also with a somewhat different audience than we normally converse with in the Netherlands or abroad. And we sincerely hope also that this may be a stepping stone for future collaborations in the future. As Yael already said, my name is Klaas Stutje, and this is my colleague Daniel Hendriksen, and we are both working at the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And this is the
program.
The program, so now we have to switch to our PowerPoint. But I can already, let me wait for a moment. Yeah. So, and then I go to the next one. So today we want to introduce you to the role we play in restitution procedures in the Netherlands and to some of the projects that we have been developing concerning research and restitution of objects that were taken in colonial contexts, but also those taken in the context of Nazi persecution, so both fields. And doing so, we will hopefully also give you an idea of the state of affairs in the Netherlands in general right now. And then in the second part of this presentation, we like to draw your attention to what we define as a very fruitful intersection between both fields, and give our take on the panorama, the research panorama that Yael was talking about, I think, in the study day of November. And we will argue that even though both traumatic histories of the dispossession, both fields of research and both campaigns for restitution have important specificities and deserve a focused attention in their own right, it is nevertheless fruitful to bring both fields analytically in relation and to study them in coherence, and also to examine their overlap. Finally, we will make our story more concrete by further delving into one historical intersection, namely African art on the Dutch art market during the Second World War. So, in other words, I mean, we have roughly an hour, a bit less. We will have an informative part at the beginning of the presentation of around 15 minutes, then a bit more of a theoretical section in the second part, again around 15 minutes, and then ending with the historical section with concrete examples, and that's then the third part, and then we'll have some conclusions that hopefully give food for thought for the later Q&A. So
Yes, so first I will tell a bit about our institute. We're both from the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, based in Amsterdam, which is an academic and scientific institution. It was founded right after the end of the Second World War on the 8th of May 1945 in order to document the war in the Netherlands and the occupation. Nowadays we have roughly 90 employees, 40 of which are researchers. We both have a research department and an archive. We are based under the Netherlands Academy of Sciences. As the name of our institute suggests, we deal with the Holocaust, mass violence, genocide, and there are social and long-term consequences. And art restitution and provenance research is one of those consequences, you might say. Other themes that our colleagues research are victimhood, perpetratorship, trauma and memory cultures, transitional justice, and the restoration of rights. What is very important today, if you could go to the next slide, is that the NIOD also hosts the ECR, or the Expert Center Restitution, of which Klaas and I are part. And this has been established in 2018, and it followed a re-evaluation of the policies regarding the restitution of Nazi-looted art in the Netherlands. The aim was to create one central institution where experts do independent research into Nazi-looted art, combining knowledge and expertise that was formerly scattered across the academic and scientific landscape. So the Expert Center today has 8 to 10 researchers, and we are tasked with the following tasks. First of all, we do factual investigations, so we write research reports when the restitutions committee asks for them. So when there is a restitution case, when there's a claimant, we write a report, and that is the basis on which the Minister of Culture makes a decision whether a piece of art is restituted or not. Secondly, we do independent and innovative scientific research into the history of looting, into the history of provenance and restitution. And for this, we have our own research agenda. And thirdly, we promote and increase societal attention for the issue of looted art and restitution through lectures, publications, and also through education. We're both involved at the University of Amsterdam. So in all, we write around 10 research reports per year, for Nazi-looted art. We also publish articles and write lectures. There's one colleague of us doing a PhD project, and we are also involved in research concerning colonial looted art. So we play a constitutive role in the restitution policy, which we do independently in the Netherlands and scientifically. And there we are a partner with the restitutions committee and collecting holding institutions such as museums.
Now, a similar constitutive but independent position we take in the field of restitution of colonial collections in the Netherlands. and well, I probably don't have to tell you, but I'll still do, around the year 2017, 2018, we have seen an upsurge of debates and policies around the restitution of objects taken from colonial contexts. Of course, with a long prehistory in the decades before, we should not forget, but since 2017-18, it gained new traction, you could say. Of course, there was the important report of Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy. There were in several countries changing legislations and policies, and ever since there has been a modest but ongoing wave of restitutions of objects from various countries in Europe to several countries in mostly Africa, Asia, Latin America, but we should also add Oceania and sometimes North America as well. In the Netherlands, since 2022, we have an official restitutions committee, and this is the Colonial Collections Committee, that advises the Minister of Culture on restitution requests when it concerns state collections. And in the Netherlands, most of the relevant collections that we are talking about, so the collections, for instance, in ethnographic museums such as the Wereldmuseum, but also in the Rijksmuseum, those collections are all state collections. So that's perhaps a bit the same case as in France, but different than, for instance, in the UK. This committee, this restitutions committee, has its own policy directives, and it advises for the unconditional return of cultural heritage objects if it can be demonstrated, for instance through provenance research and with a reasonable degree of certainty, that objects were indeed lost involuntarily in a certain context. In those cases where it cannot be demonstrated that objects were looted, or when it is clear that it was acquired in somewhat more peaceful ways, if you want to call it that, these objects may still be eligible for return, but in those cases the committee weighs the interests at stake, both interests in the Netherlands of institutions and interests in countries and communities of origin. Now, based on these policy directives, 6 collections have now been returned to Indonesia. Well, these 6 collections, they consist of hundreds of objects, but 6 collections in total. 1 collection returned to Sri Lanka, 1 to the Native American Pueblo of the Isleta del Sur in the United States, and in February 2025, a collection of Benin bronzes was restituted to the Federal Republic of Nigeria, to the NCMM, the National Committee in Nigeria. In the latter case, so regarding the Benin bronzes, it concerned 114 objects that were held by the Dutch state, and 6 objects that were held by the municipality of Rotterdam, but the municipalities often follow the national state. So in total it concerned 120 objects, all of which were in custody of museums of the Wereldmuseum, so the World Museum. Now, for the sake of completeness, I want to mention one other case, another cast bronze plaque from Benin, that was restituted to the Oba of Benin in November 2025. This bronze was not a state-owned object, but came from a museum with a privately owned collection, so the Fundatie in Zwolle. And we will come back to this case later in the presentation as well. The fact that it was a part of a privately owned collection, and as such not part of the national policy, also explains why this object could be returned to the Oba of Benin, whereas the other objects returned to the state of Nigeria. Now, an important difference between the procedures around the restitution of objects from colonial contexts and those from contexts of Nazi persecution is the fact that provenance research to colonial collections is primarily the responsibility of the holding institutions themselves, rather than an expert center such as, for instance, the Expert Center Restitution in the NIOD. In other words, for colonial collections, it's not the NIOD that does the provenance research, but museums or universities or other institutions that actually hold the collection. For us, as NIOT, this means that we take a bit more of a facilitating role. So, in relation to colonial collections, we are part of a some sort of a spearhead group, you could say, of 5 organizations, the so-called Colonial Collections Consortium. 5 organizations, among which NIOT, but also Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, again Wereldmuseum, a military museum with a lot of objects from Indonesia, Bronbeek, and the National Heritage Agency. And these 5 organizations have a bit more experience with this topic, you could say, and are grouped together to help or to facilitate the broader field in doing provenance research. And this broader field consists both of other museums and other institutions in the Netherlands, art museums that don't have the necessary expertise, for instance, but also countries, communities of origin, or individuals who seek advice or and so forth. And we do so as a consortium, as a working group. We do so by organizing events and work visits. So every now and then delegations from countries come to the Netherlands to visit depots or for discussions. We do share knowledge. And we work on creating a research infrastructure for provenance research. And concretely, this means that since 2019, NIOT, or ACR, within this consortium, has been working on a number of things. One was that we published a methodological guideline, part of a larger report with the name of Clues. You see the cover up there. We had a fellowship program running for a couple of years, which has right now come to an end, but in total we had 7 researchers from Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Brazil, to conduct provenance research themselves. And this we did in collaboration with NIAS and KITLV. And we created a series of research aids. And this was in connection with a larger catalog for colonial collections, the Data Hub. And you can visit the website. I think I included it, colonialcollections.nl. And then you have these digital research aids where you can find all kinds of information about museums, collectors, but also missionaries who collected, military who collected, other collecting bodies in the Netherlands, and find where are sources or knowledge that you need to do provenance research in the right way. So all of these projects aim primarily to enable others, either people in countries of origin or curators in the Netherlands, for instance, to do research in museums or archival collections independently. Now, finally, there is one other thing, that in some cases, in special cases you could say, we also do provenance research at NIOT in the context of a restitution claim. So, as I already said, it's the primary responsibility of museums to do this research. But sometimes museums are unable to do that, or not willing to do that, or they don't have the facilities. And in those cases, the restitutions committee needs a solution, and then we might step in as NIOT on an ad hoc basis. So, for instance, there was a large restitution case, a claim by Indonesia of a natural historical collection. And the Natural Historical Museum in the Netherlands, Naturalis, said, well, we don't have the capacity right now to do this. Also the expertise, because you need historians or people with archival experience, for instance. So there was a problem there, and then we could help out. So we created then a research report that formed the basis for the later restitution of this collection to Indonesia. So the collection has now, formally it has been restituted, but now it's in the process of returning. It's a very large collection. So, as you hear, the NIOT Expert Center Restitution plays an active role in both research fields and in both procedures of restitution. So we have also colleagues that have experience in both fields. Nevertheless, in the Netherlands, as in other countries of Europe, there seems to be a strong compartmentalization when we regard the institutional development of both fields. So the respective restitutions committees operate separately. The professionals in the field are hardly connected, and among provenance researchers and theorists, there appears to be some sort of an unwillingness to study both fields in relation. Now, in a way, this is understandable, because as I said in the beginning, these fields deserve attention in their own right. And for instance, for victim groups or advocacy groups on both sides, so those striving for justice and indemnification for Nazi persecution, but also for those fighting for recognition and reparations for historical wrongs of colonialism and slavery, it is very understandable that these groups fear that the attention for their cause and their grief is diverted if you bring everything together. And both groups have fought long and ongoing struggles for recognition and structures of reparations, and they are perhaps not willing to give that up easily. Nevertheless, from a methodological and academic point of view, and this is where we are working in as NIOD, the compartmentalization of both major strands of provenance research is a missed opportunity. Separated in terms of research funding, educational facilities, groups of expertise, schools of thought, both fields do not profit from one another's theoretical discussions, best practices, research experiences. And this pillarization of both research fields is also against recent calls, for instance, of German colleagues like Christoph Zuschlag and Michael Hopp, Christian Fuhrmeister, who have argued for professionalization of this trade of provenance research, and also to emancipate the field of provenance research from being an auxiliary science for the art market, or for being a tool in restitution procedures, or the political act of restitution. But they argue for an emancipation of the field. And if provenance research is a thing in and of itself, we need to integrate both fields. So this is we're now moving into the second part of the more theoretical part of the presentation. So the assumption that we are dealing with two entirely separate contexts of historical injustice, we will argue today. We can discuss this about this in the Q&A. This assumption that we're talking about two separate fields is partly false, as in fact there are interesting intersections between both fields. And a number of these intersections were already highlighted in the introduction of Yael in the study day in November. And right now we group together three major intersections that each contain a number of aspects. So first of all, it is conceptually important to see that the history of the Holocaust and the history of colonialism took place in the same dimension of time, or the same calendar. And in a second we will elaborate a bit more on that. Secondly, there are important similarities of doing provenance research, which justify to look at both fields in cohesion. And thirdly, Daniel will talk about that further, there is the issue of overlapping histories, sometimes resulting in layered loss of possession, from the trade in ethnographic objects and objects from colonial contexts in the period 1933-1945. Okay, so first the first issue, so that they are part of this conceptually the same calendar. So often the history of dispossession and collecting in colonial contexts is seen as a story of 400 years that took place largely in the colonized regions in the global south. By contrast, the history of looting and dispossession of the Nazis is regarded as a story of 12 years, 1933-1945, that took place on the European continent. As such, these histories seem to unfold on a different calendar almost, connected only by the present day's discourse of restitution and reparation and reconciliation. So it's our present day that holds both fields together, but the fields in themselves, they don't seem to speak to each other. Thus, we can read, for instance, in the 2019 Provenance research manual on Nazi-looted art of the German Lost Art Foundation, that although there are certain, and I quote, although there are certainly some parallels in terms of methods and approaches, the differences in historical conditions, ethical assessment, and current legal framework are nevertheless so significant that joint treatment would not have been sensible. Now, this conceptualization of the Second World War and the Holocaust and the history of colonialism as two separate historical conditions hinders us from seeing that there are actually important continuities and some simultaneities that bring both histories together. And let me emphasize here, and this, I mean, it's an obvious point, but the Second World War was in fact a world war with global impact, resulting in global displacement of artifacts. And in the coming minutes, I will just give a number of examples that hopefully make this fact clear or tangible again, or palpable again. So, arguably, the first armed conflicts against fascism before 1939 took place outside of Europe. Of course, we have the Spanish Civil War, very important, we should not forget. But in 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War started, in which Japanese military resorted to large-scale looting. In 1935, fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia, leading to the Second Italo-Abyssinian War between 1935 and 1937, which resulted in the looting of the obelisk of Axum and the statue of the Lion of Judah. And also to the fascist policy and also colonial policies that Iannelli and Pankhurst described during the study day. Also, without fascist invasion, colonized countries were culturally affected by the war. And again, at the study day, we have seen a nice example of Professor Oluranti Edward Ojo from the University of Abuja, reminding us of the impact of the war on Nigerian cultural practices and the local art market. For instance, through the conscription, as he told us, of 140 Nigerian youths, leading to a rupture in the intergenerational transmission of cultural practices and knowledge. And then we also had an intervention of Sofiane Bourdiba from the University of Tunis, describing the large-scale and preventive evacuation of artifacts and archives from Tunisia to France, where, as I understood, was not so sure, but apparently they are still here in France, these objects and collections. In the Netherlands, we had similar debates. For instance, we had the historian Louis Zweers, who has documented the large-scale looting of Indonesian and European possessions by the Japanese army in Southeast Asia between 1942 and 1945. Well known are the activities of the so-called monuments men and monuments women, so the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives Section Unit, which was a militarized unit of art experts that followed in the wake of the advance of Allied armies in occupied Europe. But it is less known that the same unit was also active in Asia, where they retraced looted works of art and culture in Japan. And they did so in their own way. There's some literature also about it, but it's a fact often forgotten. Right now at the Expert Center for Restitution, we are involved in a restitution case where we are asked to investigate a collection of royal treasures from a kingdom on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi for the Colonial Collections Committee. And this collection was, for instance, violently taken by Dutch troops in 1946 and subsequently lost. This took place just months after the capitulation of Japan, and right in the beginning of the Indonesian War of Independence. And in the policy, this falls on the colonial collections, and as such, we are also involved. Indonesia wants those collections back. But you could also argue that it's very much part of a story of the Second World War in Asia, in this case in Indonesia. And what struck me, and it's again a very simple fact, but some of the people who personally experienced this violent loss in 1946 they are still alive. They were, of course, very young children back then, but they are still alive. But right now they are as old as some of the last direct victims of Nazi persecution. So in other words, the history of colonial dispossession was not over when Nazi looting took place. And actually, these examples demonstrate that often the colonial history and the history of the Second World War are entwined. And what's more, they share some of the same roots and the same afterlives. So talking about the roots, I think, again, this is a known fact, but the perception of certain types of African and Islamic art as primitive, inferior, and of European artworks featuring African motifs and African styles as degenerate. So this perception has, of course, roots that are much deeper than fascism and go back to colonial and Orientalist worldviews. So the roots can be regarded as in part the same. The afterlives can also be similar. So we want to mention the work of Leora Bilski here, for instance, who in an article of 2021, and this article was aptly called The Virtues of Comparing, compared the early post-war Jewish restitution campaigns of the 1940s and 1950s with the contemporary post-colonial restitution debate and also the restitution campaigns taking place in the 1950s, 60s, 70s in colonized, formerly colonized or still colonized countries back then. So her article demonstrates that both fields can indeed profit from an integrated analysis. So this was basically if you remember, so they're taking place on the same dimension of time. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the similarities in the practice of provenance research. So a very different reason to study both fields in relation is the fact that despite some obvious differences, provenance research provenance research in both fields is less different than often assumed. And we see this actually in our working practice. Because as Jonathan Fine and Hilke Tode Aurora, I'm now thinking, do I pronounce them rightly? But okay. As they argued in the 2019 guidelines issued by the Deutsche Museumsbund, researching the provenance of objects from colonial contexts often does not differ fundamentally from researching those of other contexts. Our experience from working in both fields is that much of the work is a bit similar. To sum up some technical points and some political points, first of all, a common frustration of all provenance researchers is that the circumstances of violence and also later curatorial ignorance and disorganization resulted in archival chaos. Over the decades, cultural goods often got lost, they got mixed up, they got renamed, they got renumbered, they were changed. So much of the research focuses on connecting the dots and listing the numbers and deciphering the codes and the stamps and all that. In both fields, researchers have to combine sources of various kinds, ranging from museum documentation, information derived from objects themselves, so object analysis in several ways, administration of looting institutions, sales lists, stock books, digital resources and databases, alternative sources, photographs, interviews, also oral histories. So we have to use all those sources, and because of the essentially transnational nature of the dispossession, these sources are also scattered around and to be found at various locations. So provenance research is a creative and multidisciplinary search and often compared to the work of detectives on both sides. Third thing, gaps in provenance. So in a majority of cases, researchers, but also claimants, museums, politicians, have to deal with the gaps in provenance history of objects and with question marks around the circumstances of dispossession. So in the words of Jijde, Akinsha and Walsh, and I quote, "Provenance research can be challenging and frustrating. One may spend hours and hours, days and weeks following a trail that leads to nowhere," unquote. Moreover, and this is a difficult truth in restitution procedures, a smoking gun or a source that really pinpoints what happened is often not found. And consequently, there is often a degree of uncertainty and speculation in reconstructing an object's provenance. And this fact, the inherent degree of uncertainty, leads to tension as we are operating in a political field with high stakes, where the question is, do we restitute or don't we? So it's a yes or no, and what if you don't really have the history clear? And this is the more political side of similarities. So there's this problem of scale. While it appears that the number of objects taken in colonial context is much higher than works looted by Nazis, so in colonial context we're often talking about hundreds of thousands of objects, if not even more, versus tens of thousands of objects. And it all depends, of course, on how you count. This numerical difference does not qualitatively affect the practice of provenance research, because in both fields, historians and curators have to reckon with this problem of scale and the fundamental limitation in the time and money available. And therefore, prioritization is very important. So researchers in both fields have to set priorities that can be informed by several reasons. So historical reasons, right? Perhaps there was a wrongful dispossession. Administrative considerations, for instance, prioritizing those objects that are on display or pursuing due diligence on the art market. And we have political circumstances, so for instance, objects that are subject to restitution claims. There are several considerations why to prioritize, but we have to prioritize, that is clear. And as a consequence, provenance researchers are often pressured, maybe directly and often indirectly, by stakeholder groups, museums, politicians, to speed up the process, to provide clear answers, drawing generalizing conclusions, defining clearly demarcated suspect collections and red flags. And again, this is understandable because we have to provide clarity for aging and long patient families and countries and communities of origin. But by the nature of our material, it is also quite difficult to provide these clear answers. And it results in the fact that provenance researchers on both sides are operating in a political setting with high interests at stake. So, all in all, there are these large similarities in doing provenance research, and I think that justifies to bring both fields in comparison and to reflect on that and how one field is operating and how the other field is operating, and to learn from those best practices also. So these were two intersections. So we had one, again, same dimensions of time, similarities in practice of provenance research. Let's now move on, if we still have energy and interest. Let's move on to the third part.
Yes, so after we've heard from class those commonalities, on a more theoretical level, I will give some illustrations like in case studies of the issue of so-called double loot or layered dispossession, focusing on African objects on the Dutch art market during and around the time of the Second World War, and also in the pre-war period, so from the period of 1933, focusing on one art dealer and two art collectors. So this issue of which we will now just call double loot, but of course its dispossession is much more varied than looting. This issue gained some attention in March 2018 when a Benin bronze was auctioned in Germany. it became clear that the bronze had been part of the collection of Rudolf Mosse, a Jewish German industrial entrepreneur, and that his collection had been unjustly expropriated during the years of the so-called Third Reich. The auction house in 2018 negotiated a settlement with the heirs of the Mosse family, without considering whether the Benin bronze was perhaps looted in the 1897 attack of British troops on the Kingdom of Benin in Nigeria. The Mosse case is interesting from a moral and legal point of view, asking the question whose injustice should be repaired first. It draws some attention to a small category of cases in which Jewish owners and art dealers were robbed from cultural goods that were acquired under colonialism. However, we should approach this topic with caution, as it may lead to the impression that Jewish art dealers had a special role or special responsibility in the trade or dispossession in non-Western art, and may imply a competition of victims. Needless to say, this is not the viewpoint that we take. So, if we focus on the Dutch art market during the German occupation, we will briefly discuss the art dealer and the collectors who were part of the same network, but had quite different experiences during the Second World War. The first person that we want to focus on is Karel van Lier. Van Lier was a Dutch Jewish art dealer who was based in Amsterdam. He had his own gallery from 1921 onwards. He combined modern art, especially paintings, but also photography, with African and oceanic objects, as you can see in the painted portrait. Because he took a new and innovative approach, he was quite successful and respected. It is said that Van Lier was the first art dealer in the Netherlands to focus primarily on African art. The African art in his gallery he mostly acquired through French and Belgian networks. He visited auctions and art dealers in Brussels and Paris to acquire sculptures and other objects. From the French dealer Charles Raton, he had several objects on consignment, including some Benin bronze pieces. One of them was the bronze plaque that ended up in Museum de Fundatie, which Klaas mentioned, and has been restituted last year. Van Lier was married to a non-Jewish wife, so at the start of the German occupation, he was relatively safe from anti-Jewish measures. However, once Jews were forbidden to travel, he could no longer operate his gallery. His daughter, who was 17 years old at the time, continued the business for him. On April 17, 1933, Germans arrested Van Lier for working with the resistance. His name had been found in an address book from a resistance fighter. He was deported to several concentration camps in Germany and died in early 1945. Part of the collection of Van Lier was sold under duress during the occupation to German museums, such as the Museum für Völkerkunde in Frankfurt am Main. In early 1940, at the start of the occupation, the Dutch government in exile had stated that all trade with the Germans was deemed illegal. So, when after the war the monuments men, which Klaas mentioned, discovered objects that had entered Germany during the period of the war, they transported them back to the Netherlands. This included several objects that Van Lier had sold to, for example, the museum in Frankfurt, including this statuette from Côte d'Ivoire, as the property card says. These objects are still in the state collection because they are classified as Nazi-looted art. At the same time, we do not know how Van Lier actually acquired this object and whether it is a case of double loot. One of Van Lier's customers in Amsterdam was the German banker Georg Thielmann. He was of Jewish descent and he fled to the Netherlands just before the Nazis took power in Germany. In the Netherlands, his interest in collecting African and Asiatic art was awakened, and between 1933 and 1939, he collected over 2,000 objects, mostly from the Dutch East Indies. He even hired someone called Karel Groeneveld to travel to the East Indies and to buy objects on a very large scale, because he did not have time to go there himself, but he had a lot of money. Thielmann also had several African objects, including a Benin bronze, which is also on the slide. Shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, in August 1939, Thielmann and his wife escaped to England. He left his massive collection in the custody of the Colonial Institute in Amsterdam, and he also hid it there. This prevented it from being confiscated by the Germans during the occupation. Here, the museum director Bertram Schieke played a very important role, because he helped Thielmann to hide his collection. And this was a very large contrast with, for example, another museum director based in Rotterdam in the local Land- en Volkenkunde Museum called Sjoerd Hofstra, because during the occupation, Hofstra acquired objects from dubious art dealers who traded in stolen Jewish property. So, in total, Hofstra made 73 acquisitions, which are now deemed suspect. To return to Thielmann, Thielmann and his wife were able to reach the United States in early 1940, but his health deteriorated and he died of cancer in 1941. He did not see his art collection again. After the war, the Thielmann collection was still in the Colonial Institute in Amsterdam, and in the 1990s his son donated the entire collection to the museum as a gift. What is very interesting, especially about the Benin bronze in this collection, is that it is one of the 114 objects from the Wereldmuseum that were restituted last year to Nigeria. In this case, the fact that the bronze was part of a delicate history of the Holocaust was not mentioned in the decision by the Restitutions Committee for Colonial Collections. This is a stark contrast with the Mosse case that I mentioned earlier. Whereas with the restitution of the Mosse collection, we saw that the colonial history of the Benin bronze was ignored, and there was only focus on the history of the Mosse family during the Third Reich. In the case of the restitution of the Thielmann Benin bronze, we see that the Holocaust history of this particular piece is left unmentioned. Another customer of Van Lier was the German banker and art collector Eduard von der Heydt. So his role was quite similar as Thielmann's, also a banker, also from Germany, and also an art collector, focusing mostly on African and Asian art. But the contrast is that von der Heydt was not Jewish. Von der Heydt's case is an example of an art collector who was implicated in the Nazi regime and whose colonial art played a role there. Because of his wealth, von der Heydt amassed a large art collection. He collected modern painters like Picasso and Cézanne, but even more objects from Asia, Africa, and Oceania. He exhibited his collection first at his house in Amsterdam, and from 1925 onwards in a museum in the coastal village of Zandvoort. It showcased mainly his Asiatic art as well as modern artists in a very eclectic setting, and the former German Emperor Wilhelm II was a regular visitor there. In 1927, von der Heydt acquired the mountain of Monte Verita in Switzerland, and in 1936 he became a Swiss citizen. At the same time, von der Heydt sponsored the NSDAP and was an early member of the Nazi Party. His collection of African and Asian art might seem at odds with the Nazi ideology of degenerate art, but for von der Heydt, it was not contradictory. He combined an alternative spiritual lifestyle with conservative nationalist political views, and he also had close contacts with Göring and Goebbels. Maybe because of those close ties, maybe because he was located in Switzerland, von der Heydt was able to keep his art collection alongside with his radical viewpoints. He believed in the universality of art, but at the same time in the racist and militarist policies of the Third Reich. At the end of his life, he donated his collection to the Riedberg Museum in Zurich and the von der Heydt Museum in Wuppertal. His art has not yet been subject of a restitution claim. Of course, these are just a few examples of the intersection of thinking about the fate of ethnographic collections in the Second World War. Not only were the histories of colonialism and the Second World War entangled, as Klaas mentioned earlier, taking place in the same historical dimension or calendar. We also see that in some cases ethnographic and non-Western art became subject in the history of the Holocaust and anti-Semitic persecutions of Jewish owners, collectors, and art dealers. We have just seen 3 examples of Karel van Lier, the art dealer and in colonial objects, who had to sell some of them under duress to German museums. There was Georg Tillman, who had to flee the Nazis but had to leave his collection behind, and Eduard van der Heydt, who was an eclectic art collector and sympathizer with the Nazi regime. In this regard, it is important to remind that the fate of ethnographic collections and their Jewish owners is not something special, but actually quite a normal case, you could say. Just like the rest of European societies, a percentage of collectors and art dealers of ethnographic objects was Jewish. Similarly, some museum directors of ethnographic museums played a dubious or opportunistic role, while others helped out where they could. The issue of double loot, therefore, is rather than a moral and juridical problem today, it is a more problem today than it was remarkable in the past.
Okay, time for some conclusions, I think. So we began our presentation with an informative overview of what we do in the Expert Center, both on the field of colonial contexts and Nazi persecution, in which we both play a role. And our experience has taught that the strict separation and compartmentalization between both fields is detrimental. And that it's actually fruitful to explore this intersection. So firstly, if we look at the dislocation of cultural artifacts and the destabilization of cultural knowledge on the African continent in the period between the end of 1930s and 1945, we see that the histories of looting in the context of colonialism and the Second World War were entwined, rooted in the same traditions of racism and hierarchical thinking, and with partly shared afterlives in the form of restitution campaigns. Now, then we talked about seeing the similarities in the ways we do provenance history, both technically but also operating in a political field, where we argue that we have to take the insights from both fields seriously in order to emancipate the field. And finally, we saw these concrete examples by Daniel. And I want to close with what I mentioned in the beginning, because what we hope is that this presentation maybe, or some other meetings, may be stepping stones for future collaborations, both regarding colonial collections and Nazi-looted art. Because we have seen, for instance, in our discussion of the characteristics of provenance research, but also, again, in the examples that Daniel gave, the very transnational character of trajectories of African collections in Europe and of those key players and museums. Both in our work around collections from colonial contexts and around Nazi-looted art, we can therefore we hope therefore that we can further intensify our contacts with colleagues abroad and also strengthen our collaborations. And on this note, we end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
So that was quite a long talk, but
no, but I'm just going to sit back down. Thank you so much. I actually learned a lot, and it was really a lot of food for thoughts. I might just jump in, and then if any, we really would like to open to the room if there is any questions. So I'm going to start with a very concrete question and a detail, but I wonder if the Van der Heijdt bronze was just restituted by Zurich last week, or if it was not part of the group, because the Rietberg Museum and the Swiss museums in general just had a number of restitutions to Nigeria just now. So I wonder if it's part of the group or not. You don't know. So I'll look, yeah.
I don't know, actually. Last time I checked, it was still on the museum website. But it might be, I don't know, actually.
So, checked 2 weeks ago, maybe.
It might just have happened right after.
Yeah.
Okay. No, but I think a lot of the things that you brought up are really central to some of the questions that were already, that I guess we've been grappling with, which is this idea of the complexity of addressing a topic like African art during World War II, and this juxtaposition of issues related to colonial history and Nazi-era history of victimhood, and is how to avoid a sense of hierarchical in victimhood, which, as you say, if the focus becomes restitution to Nigeria, then the history of World War II disappears, and if you focus on the other, then it's the history of colonialism disappear. And I think in the end, what everybody wants is just for the stories to be told. I mean, I know there is also something about actually getting the objects, of course, but I think it's also really about being heard and about the histories to be visible and to be presented as fully as they can. And so I think it's just moving into that direction of being able to tell fuller histories that are also more complex and that are more nuanced, and and not just slapping everything into the same narrative and making shortcuts. But I think you really presented that, both of you, in a very clear way. It was also interesting to me to hear the quote that you used from the German guidelines for provenance research from 2019, right? That is still saying that the two approaches should really be separated. But then the Jonathan Fine and Hilde Tudor-Hora, it's also from 2019, right? And it was also about German provenance research, but they had a different perspective. So I gather that it has been discussed simultaneously from both perspectives in Germany. And I thought that was also quite history, and how the narrative is also changing now, maybe in some sense, at least. So since when in the Netherlands do you have kind of a think tank that is considering both in connection, both histories in collection? When did it start? Or because
you mean like the topic of today, or when did we?
Yes.
Yeah, Actually, it is not really part of. It's just among us with the Expert Center. Just the very fact that we are around 8 people, and specifically 2 of us are really into colonial collections, and 6 or so, 7. Also in Nazi-looted art, that the question basically comes up. But it is not, and therefore, like the original mission of the Expert Center Restitution, like also the foundational documents, it was and still is very much focused on Nazi-looted art. Also because we have this role in this restitutions procedure, and we also get money to do that. But nevertheless, we now start to broaden our focus for instance, in the way we describe ourselves on the website. So before it was, we are an institute focusing on Nazi-looted art. By the way, we also have some colonial collections, colonial projects. And right now, actually, last week we were thinking, well, maybe we need to update the text on the website a little bit. And then you perhaps want to start with the fact that what we are studying is restitution and provenance research, and that can be done in several contexts. And we now happen to focus on Nazi-looted art and colonialism, but of course the history of the USSR is there. We could also focus maybe on Armenia or Ukraine or other very, very different contexts. So maybe take a bit more of a meta perspective and see what is going on in all these contexts, rather than that you say that you're one or the other. But this is, this is something in progress. This is a process, rather than that it's really a political decision or so.
Right.
Yeah.
I will continue with one more question about Karel van Leer specifically. So I didn't quite understand what happened with the rest of his collection and with the holdings of his gallery. Did it continue after the war with his daughter, or did all of it get dispersed, or what happened?
So after the war, another person took over the gallery, who was not actually a family member, but also called Van Leer, Leendert van Leer. He continued for a couple of years, and then afterwards. He had to close down the gallery because there was not enough interest in this kind of art at the time. So I think the main part of the collections were taken over by the new owner, but there is still quite, I think, maybe 10 or 20 objects which are in the state collections from Van Leer.
So in the Netherlands?
In the Netherlands, and they're labeled as Nazi-looted art.
And so when you say the state collection, what museum is that? Is it or is it the group of, is it the Wereldmuseum? Or
so it's it is some of the objects are dispersed over several museums, and most are in the depot.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the works that were sold under duress to the German museums, that was still him, or it was already his daughter? Is it just
both?
Both.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you mean this is the NK collection, right? So,
yeah.
The what collection?
So this is then what we always say NK collection. So national. This is the collection basically of art, of objects, but mostly paintings, art that was found in German depots, in salt mines and all that, and that from the collection point was sent back to the Netherlands. A portion of that was restituted already in the end of the 1940s. A portion was then auctioned off or donated to museums on a
so it's like the manière. Okay.
Of course.
Okay.
But then there's still a considerable number of objects, some thousands.
3,000.
3,000, right? Yeah. 3,000 objects, and they are presently in Amersfoort in the depot of the Cultural Heritage Agency.
Okay. Yeah. But so So some African objects were part of these NK collections then?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that is...
and also some Asian objects.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is then also a matter of because as with many objects from colonial context, it's not really well kept where objects originate, and then you have this history of the Second World War that went over it. So you have these images of just after the war where people could visit specific exhibitions. Where all these objects were exhibited in order to enable people to say, well, this is my painting, that is my table or my chair or whatever. And you have a lot of rugs, but also African objects and other, mostly Asian objects or Chinese. Exactly, and then they are not recognized, and they are now part of the collection of NK. Yeah.
What's interesting to me also is that the one Van Leer object you showed that is in the German museum now is that it's described as being from Côte d'Ivoire, but it's not.
Yeah.
And so this is, one of the problem I think with African objects and maybe from other provenance as well, or origins, is that there is a problem in identification, there is a problem in, and also if you don't have a photograph, then that's it, because you have nothing. At least, because the work is in a museum, there is actually a photograph. I think it's from the Congo.
It's not in the German museum. It's in the
so
Dutch.
This one is part of. So this one has been restituted. Sorry, has been sent back to the
Netherlands, but not.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it's no longer. So it went to the German museum. It was bought under duress by the German museum, and then went back to the Netherlands. Okay.
Yeah, but it illustrates already how complicated it is.
Yes.
Yeah, and then there's of course the lack of information, sometimes the lack of photography or an illustration. So it's all those layers upon layers of complications. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Yes. Ah oui, super, merci.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you very much. It was very interesting. I have a question because you showed some samples of cases. Have you made an evaluation of the number of cases that you're dealing that are specifically for colonial art collectors? Or, as we are aware, many Jewish collectors had some few items that were colonial. Or how are you making a difference, or how are you working on it? Are you working first the cases that you're sure they were art dealers for African art, and then the other collectors, or is it parallel, or how you do? Yeah, I would like to know how you proceed.
Practically. Just talking about numbers, and I'm a bit uncertain here, but I think so. When the restitutions policy in the Netherlands came into being around the year 2000, after the Washington Principles, this number has been. There's a count of numbers. I think we're around 200 cases now, where there was a decision taken, and of course this was Nazi looted art. And to my knowledge, there was not really a case where it concerned ethnographic objects or African objects. Or
there were some.
Okay,
so,
maybe.
For example, there was a claim from the Van Leer family. The decision was that most of it was from an art trader, so that was not part of the restitutions policy. But one object, which was an ivory horn, which had been carved from Africa, was restituted because there was a picture with him actually blowing that horn. And it was deemed as a personal object and therefore restituted. Yeah. So that is one. But most of the other cases, I think maybe actually all of the other cases, are either from fine art, such as old master paintings, or furniture objects, stuff like that.
China porcelain, or?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. But so this is the one, the Nazi looted art part, and then colonial collections, as we have already said, it's only on an ad hoc basis, and it happened twice now that we did a report on that. But this policy is also relatively new, because I think the first case of restitution was only a couple of years ago. So that's 2 versus 200. Yeah, we basically follow the procedure there. So we try to answer to the best of our abilities the kind of questions that are asked by the respective restitutions committees. And therefore we do not take this report as an opportunity to reflect on significations and meanings and full histories and all that. At least it has not been a case so far, because it was not it was not necessary, because there was no case of double history here. At the same time,
and there was, for example, a very interesting other case of double loot in one of those research claims, restitution claims, which was about an small ivory figure, which was originally from Byzantine. And it belonged to, at the beginning of the 20th century, to a Russian aristocratic family, which was forced to auction by the new Russian regime after the Russian Revolution. And it turned up with an art trader in Amsterdam, who lost it because he was Jewish. So there we have another issue of double loot. Not colonial, but with a connection to the USSR.
And maybe even triple, because this is the stela, right? So, so it's also grave, connected gravestone, so to say, from a Byzantium context. So I mean, of course, we have no indications that here there's something wrong. But on the other hand, you can also depart from your gut feeling that taking something from a grave context is probably not ethical or so. You can reflect on that. And then you have the Byzantium moment, then you have the moment around the Russian Revolution, then you have the Nazi period. So you have 3 moments where you can argue that an object was entangled in a delicate history, so to say.
Yeah, but the thing here is that we both have this kind of scientific view or outlook, and where we are now, we are advocating to combine those views and to combine the histories and to take a more holistic approach. But at the same time, there are also policies, and in the Netherlands it's still the case that there is a policy for the Second World War and a policy for colonial looted art. There's nothing connected to, for example, the Soviet Union. When we encounter such a case, we just have to deal with the policy that is there. So in this case it was the Nazi looted art. And then we, as researchers, we want to say, oh, but look, there's a whole other history. It's connected with other moments of violence. But as an expert center, we're also bound by the policies, which makes it sometimes a bit difficult. But maybe in the future the policies will change.
Yeah. And in a way, it's also broader. I mean, this is now we're talking about all these double. The ideas that we have, but for instance, you have quite often histories where you see a fascinating aspect or very touching story connected to an object, which has nothing directly to do with the question, how was it lost, what were the circumstances of loss. And then it's also always a question, do you then include that in the report if it doesn't really help in the case, but it's just interesting for us to know. And then often you keep it as factual as possible. Also because on a different level, we feel that it is important and an important task as a society to to have these procedures, so you don't want to step in with your academic outlook and say, well, there's many more histories now. It's really about very important procedures here that we want to be part of. And also in another way, and this desire to tell fuller histories, we're also thinking about not only moments in time, like contexts of injustice, like colonialism or Nazism, but also gender aspects, for instance, or the fact that some objects were, or items were, so for instance, there's a diamond from Indonesia in the Rijksmuseum, and we have also researched it. And this diamond is now, we don't know for sure, but it is in the interest of Indonesia to have it returned. At the same time, this is an object where you see that miners in the region of Kalimantan worked, as they still are today, worked under very dire circumstances in these mines to dig up these diamonds. And it was then in the colonial context then confiscated by the local sultan, and then it became part of a national history of Indonesia or regional history of Kalimantan. But do we need to include the miner's perspective here? Is that also, in a way, it's also injustice? And from academic point of view, I would say yes, please do. This makes it a fuller history. It tells many more stories, an object, than only an object of colonial injustice. But then at the same time, you're also part of a procedure, a political procedure.
Yeah, so there's the problem that an object could be tied to several contexts of injustice or of several contexts of looting, whereas you can only restitute it one time because there's only one object, which makes it very hard to address all those cases, as you said. Yeah.
I do have one more question about the John Tillman example that you pointed out, and it was really interesting to hear the role of the museum director in hiding the collection, right? And but then you compared it with another museum director in a different. So it's a question of individual decisions at these particular moments. Do we know if the museum director, was it at the Verent Museum? No?
The
if he hid other collections
prior to the building.
Yes. Okay. And did he hide other collections, or was it like a one-time, one example?
I think it was only this collection. Do you know?
Yeah, that I'm aware of, only this collection.
Yeah. Also because Tillman was a very well-known collector, and this collection was so large that maybe that was all the space there was in the depot. I don't know. Yeah, but it's, as far as I know, it's the only.
So the story goes really that the objects were amidst the hundreds of thousands of other objects, and Nazi officials were unable to tell one object from the other. So in that regard, it was hid in the open.
Yeah. But would they even have tried to go find them there? I mean, again, it's because was it mostly a collection of was it mostly an ethnographic collection? Sorry. Yeah. So I mean, again, one question that I do have is that was it even a type of collection that was of interest for the Nazis, or not so much? You know, would it just have been overlooked because once it's in the museum, it's not a museum they would necessarily have gone to?
No, exactly. So in that regard, it was not maybe a targeted collection.
Exactly.
But Van Lier himself was a targeted person.
Yes.
So would he had stayed behind? Oh, Tillman, sorry.
Tillman also.
Would Tillman had stayed behind, then probably his fate was much worse. Even though he died anyways, but under different circumstances.
Yeah, but there's indeed also the question. So we don't know what happened if he had not done that. So this is how it went, and it might have been looted. Otherwise, it might not have been the case. So it's very difficult to answer that question. And
then the the other museum director that you mentioned, where there is 73, sorry, I'm just trying to piece the pieces together, 73 objects that are not, that could be questions.
Yeah.
And so this is just a director who was acquiring on the market then, or who was acquiring directly putting pressure on Jewish collectors to sell, or...
Yeah, well, he was dealing with art traders who were also involved in trading Jewish collections, which was, to a part, was already known at the time, and to a part was is knowledge from later, but still you might say that that other director called Hofstra played a quite different role than the one in Amsterdam.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But so would it be possible to map specifically the market as it was at the time in the Netherlands for ethnographic objects? Mm-hmm. Through these 74 objects, maybe, like, is there a way to actually, trace who were the vendors, who had that type of collection?
Yeah, I think it is possible to a large extent, and we had one colleague who was an intern and also tried to map all the art traders in Amsterdam and the antique shops and the auction houses between 1900 and 1945. But with ethnographic collections, it's often the case that many art dealers have several paintings or statues or European artworks and some ethnographic objects, and very few examples, such as Van Lier, have mainly ethnographic objects combined with modern art or something else. So it's very hard to pinpoint who are all those other dealers who have, for example, who advertise only with paintings or advertise only with furniture, but also have a Buddha head, or also have several masks from Indonesia or African statues. And to really map them, and it would be a very interesting project, and I think we would be very much in favor of it. But it would be very hard also for the auction houses, because many auction just the possessions of someone who had deceased, and many people who had ties to Indonesia, for example, had their furniture and then also maybe a kris or a mask or a wayang puppet. And so it's very hard to actually see where all those objects went.
And it's one of the difficulties of those questions, right?
But nonetheless, even more interesting.
And especially when we look at African collections, just the fact that after, when was it, 1870 or so, there were no formal African colonies. The Netherlands were not formally colonizing African regions. Whereas Indonesia, of course, was colonized, but also Suriname, and in the Caribbean region, 6 islands in total. So the focus in the Netherlands was much more on Indonesia. So I looked up some numbers, but if you look in the collection of Wereldmuseum, for instance, we have 100,000 records that are assigned to African records, of which 40,000 objects. But then you have Asia, it's 600,000 objects, 600,000 records, 400,000 records of which from Indonesia, 200,000 objects from Indonesia. So it's 40,000 from Africa, from the whole continent, versus 200,000 from Indonesia. So this is the focus was traditionally much more on Asia, and then also, and for instance, with these research guides that we have been creating, we were able, when it comes to, for instance, Indonesia, to trace some regular routes, so missionaries, or military, or civil servants. And with regards to African collection, it seems that much of it was related to trading with African countries, because even though the Netherlands was not a formal colonizer on the African continent, there were still many Dutch trading companies active in various parts. It seems that the focus was to a large extent on Rotterdam, and then your focus also needs to be on all these trading companies, and they are by the essence of it, they are much more difficult to research, also because the trade in cultural goods was only a side business. So, for instance, they were trading in agricultural products or in other in rubber, coffee, etc. And they had this as a side business, so it was not part of their core business. Yeah. Whereas when you take Indonesia, then you can, for instance, go to the military archives and see what the extent to which military was active in Indonesia. Yeah. Missionaries, the same. Yeah, yeah. Of course, missionaries were also active in Africa. So we have, for instance, the Africa Museum near Nijmegen. Mm-hmm. It's a different, long, complicated story, but this was a museum dedicated to Africa with a collection from the Catholic mission. Mm-hmm. But this is a more recent collection, so much of it was collected only after the Second World War. Yeah.
I mean, this is also why you were saying that Karel van Leer was mostly buying from the French and Belgian dealers in the end. He's not so much buying then from the Dutch network of traders, he's really already buying on the market.
Of course, France was one of the most important art markets and had a very large presence in Africa. So to acquire African objects, many Dutch art dealers looked or went to France or to Belgium. Yeah.
Is there another? Yes?
I might just follow on the first question you asked about the Rydberg Museum and the collection, because if I read enough and understood well, the property was transferred to Nigeria, but most of the objects are staying in the museum. And so I was wondering if the double loot could be testified by the fact that they are staying now in Switzerland, that geographically they are staying in the place they have been looted a second time, and because I don't think that they are staying for this purpose, but for the fact that Switzerland wants to testify Benin past and Bronze's spoliation. So I was wondering if in your work of trying to connect these two spoliations and looted, you have some inquiries from museum to work and transmit that, because the question now is if the Rydberg Museum is going to keep the objects only telling their Benin past and not their looted Nazi past. So I was wondering if part of your work is also on that, on all the caption and the work that could be done in museum for the double looting.
So you mean also to what extent we collaborate with museums to have this? That has not been really not really. And for instance, some museums do it themselves, and so there's this prehistory of there was a project in the Netherlands where all museums were asked to investigate their own collections for Nazi looted art, and some museums did a perfect job, and other museums were a bit ignorant, and like the whole museum landscape is of course very varied. I think that some of these ethnographic museums, they started from the assumption that it doesn't concern us. We have different history, so the research wasn't done so properly, and therefore it was quite interesting to see this article by Carvin Chung and Kolstra, which appeared just recently in a journal issued by the Wereldmuseum, the Provenance series, where these two authors investigate the collections of the Wereldmuseum with this question: what was the history of the Second World War? And then it turns out that there's much more to tell than the initial assumption that ethnographic museums have no role to play in this. So that's, I think, a commendable first step, for instance, from Wereldmuseum, that they address this issue. But other than that, as I said, most of the fields are largely separate and separated, and we see it in our daily practices. We have a lot of contacts with both fields, but those fields don't really talk to each other, it seems.
Yeah, which is a pity. And maybe on the level of experts in museums and researchers in museums, people are interested in, or might be interested in, the provenance history of the objects, and maybe also, as in the case of the article, in maybe the double looting. But to also write a text for the visitor is even one step further. And so very often there's very brief provenance history on the label in a museum setting, and then also to have attention for double loot, that is still something for the future.
Yeah. But there was this exhibition not so long ago, Loot in 10 Stories in the Mauritshuis in The Hague, where they had several pieces from various contexts of injustice. It's also of varied character. But then again, there was no piece with a double history in it. So it was more a testimony, I think, of the museum, that they take all these difficult histories seriously, rather than trying to see where's the overlap. And maybe this is also much, it perhaps is also an academic interest in the first place, that you find this interesting. And therefore I also think this can be a first step to bring both fields in relation. But then maybe we should not even stop there and see objects as guides. So therefore the title of the research recommendations of prose was called clues. So objects can also be microhistorical guides, where you follow the object, and along its path it touches upon varied histories in time, but also varied persons with very varied positions in society, positions of power or no power. And importantly, the history doesn't stop today. So the object, after we give our lengthy report and the committee makes a decision, the object travels again, because perhaps it's restituted to a certain family. So it continues its journey, and along this journey, there will inevitably be new contexts in which this object gets entangled, and that makes an object a nice vehicle, basically, to connect interesting histories.
Great. Thank you. Oh yes, oui.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I want to ask a question, I think very touchy. You told that provenance searchers sometimes have a lot of pressure, and do you think that the pressure is higher when colonial contexts are the subject, or if it's spoliations of Nazi during from German And how can we do for the searchers can do their job properly without this pressure in order to do the job properly.
Yeah. Yeah, this is indeed so. Whether the question whether pressure is higher in one field versus the other, and how we deal with that. And I think this pressure, so it's not like direct political pressure, like you should do this or you should that. Don't understand me wrong. It's more that there's a pressure in terms of output. You have to deliver a report. You have to do it in a certain amount of time. We are relatively in a very fortunate position because sometimes we have months for a report to finish, but researchers in the art market or in museums, they often have to operate much more quicker in terms of hours rather than days. So there's a certain pressure to deliver clear answers. Is this object okay to acquire or not? How much can you research, right? So, and then necessarily the question then comes, okay, can you tell a certain red flags? If we have red flags, for instance, a name or a location, then we can say this object is tainted and the other object is okay. It doesn't work like that. That's not how the trade of provenance history, it's every case can be different. So that's the kind of pressure that I was alluding to.
To add to that, there could also be pressure, for example, from some claimants, if they have a lawyer who is very, who's pushing a lot of buttons and, keeps sending information or questions. And there could be pressure on the level of the artworks. So as researchers, we treat every artwork with the same kind of respect. So whether it's a very valuable painting from an old master, whether it's a Rembrandt, or if it's furniture like a chair, or if it's an ethnographic object. But the stakes also for the public could be a lot higher when it is a well-known artwork, if it has a certain iconic status.
Yeah. And to add to that, there's also an interesting difference in the fact that when we're talking about African objects or objects from Asia that are in ethnographic museums, this question is, or the debate is much more prominent that the museum itself is implicated historically in the project of colonialism and of displaying cultures and of so even though objects are not looted or acquired in more peaceful ways, then they are still part of a difficult history of displaying cultures and all that. So of course there are many different museums dealing with that differently, but I can say that my impression is that, for instance, the Wereldmuseum in the Netherlands is quite open in acknowledging that, and therefore also the fact that these objects have a difficult history is not in itself a very sensitive topic. We all know that many of these collections have difficult histories, whereas in museums, when we're talking about Nazi-looted art, it often concerns art museums that have a very respectable collection and all that. And once there's one object or a couple of objects that turn out to be wrong or tainted, and on top of that the object can be very valuable, then the stress is much higher but luckily we have the system then is designed in such a way that we are separate from the restitutions committee. So as ACR we can go all the way with the research. We will never write in a report, thus the object should go back, or thus the object should remain in the museum. But we deliver this report, and then the committee, based on all kind of policy directives, then says, okay, but then reading this report, it should return. And then, so it's an indirect, so we are a bit separate from direct political pressure. And that's, I think that's, in this case, a good thing. But yeah, it also depends, every country is different, so it's, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci.
And I will just mention, je vais juste ajouter que pour ceux d'entre vous qui ont envie de continuer avec des événements à l'INHA ce soir, à 18h30, il y a dans cette même salle une soirée autour du nom de la galerie Colbert où nous sommes ici, donc autour de Colbert et des questions autour du nom de cet espace ici à l'INHA. Dans le cadre des Voix de l'histoire de l'art, qui est un nouveau format maintenant à l'INHA, une fois par mois, c'est ça, hein, avec des discussions autour de thèmes d'histoire de l'art. Voilà. Merci beaucoup. Et donc, j'espère vous voir ici le 28 mai. Voilà. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.